Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going back to 2012, to a moment that really felt like a big bang for modern AI. We're talking about the ImageNet challenge and a model called AlexNet.
It really was the AI Big Bang. And to get why it was such an explosion, you have to picture what computer vision was like right before it. I mean, for years, the field was just stuck.
Stuck how? Because everyone was relying on these hand-engineered features.
Exactly. Things like SIFT and HOG. And what that really means is you had brilliant engineers literally telling the computer what to look for.
Okay, so you're coding in the rules like look for an edge that looks like this or find a corner with these properties.
Precisely. We were painstakingly defining what a feature was. It was incredibly clever, but it had a limit.
And that limit showed up in the ImageNet competition, the ILS VRC.
It really did. Year after year, the best models using these classic methods, they just hit a wall. Their top 5 error rate was always hovering around 25, maybe 26%. That was just as good as it got.
Yeah. And then AlexNet comes along. This team, Krzyzewski, Sitzkever, and the legendary Jeff Hinton, they show up with completely different approach.
And they didn't just beat the record, they shattered it. They dropped that error rate all the way down to 15.3%.
Wow.
It was the moment everyone realized, okay, we don't design the features, we let the machine learn the features from the data.
Yeah.
And that's our mission for this deep dive, to unpack the perfect storm of data, hardware, and algorithms that made it all possible.
Okay, let's start with the fuel for that fire then, the data. You can't do deep learning without, deep data, and that was the ImageNet project.
Which was a monumental undertaking, started by Professor Fei-Fei Li back in 2009, the sheer human effort. I mean, just imagine annotating all those images.
And for the competition, we're talking about, what was it, over 1 million images?
Over 1.2 million higher-res images, all carefully labeled across 1,000 different categories. Nothing on that scale had ever existed before. It was absolutely essential.
Essential because the model itself was so huge, right?
It was massive. AlexNet had about 60 million parameters. Think of those as knobs the network can tune.
60 million?
Yeah. And if you try to train a model that big on a small data set, it just memorizes the answers. It's called overfitting, and it's catastrophic.
So ImageNet was big enough to force the model to actually learn to generalize instead of just memorizing.
Exactly. The data was the only thing preventing it from cheating, in a way.
Okay, so you have this giant model and this giant data set. That brings us to the next bottleneck, the hardware. Trying to train this on a normal computer, a CPU, would have taken, what, months? Years?
It would have been completely impractical. The only reason it was feasible at all was because of the rise of GPUs, graphics cards, for general-purpose computing.
Right, NVIDIA's CUDO platform.
That was the game changer. The parallel processing power of a GPU cut the training time down to something manageable, like 5 or 6 days. But even then, they hit another wall.
A hard limit.
A very hard limit. Memory. The best GPU at the time, the NVIDIA GTX 580, it only had 3 gigabytes of VRAM.
Only 3 gigs. That's less than my phone has now.
Right. And it just wasn't enough space to hold all 60 million parameters, plus all the other data you need for training. It was physically impossible to run the model on one card.
So they had to get creative. They didn't have a choice.
They had no choice. They had to build this brilliant dual GPU setup. They literally split the network in half, with some layers running on one GPU and the rest on the other.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, because this compromise, this thing they were forced to do, it actually made the model better.
It's one of my favorite details of the whole story. Because the 2 GPUs could only communicate at specific points, it forced the neurons on each half to learn more independently.
So they couldn't become too codependent on each other.
Exactly. It acted like a form of regularization, forcing the network to learn more robust features. And they reported that this hardware fix, this hack, actually dropped their error rate by another 1.2%.
Incredible. Necessity really is the mother of invention.
In this case, it was the mother of a better architecture.
All right, so we've got the data and the hardware. Let's move into the engine room, the algorithms. Because even with 8 layers, you still had this fundamental problem of vanishing gradients.
Oh, yeah. With the old activation functions like sigmoid or ton, the deeper you made the network, the weaker the training signal got. By the time it got back to the early layers, it had vanished.
Which is why deep networks just didn't work very well.
Until ReLU, the rectified linear unit. And the formula is just beautifully simple. It's max of 0 and x.
So, if the input is negative, the output is 0. If it's positive, the output is just the input.
That's it. And the magic is that for any positive input, the gradient is always 1. It doesn't shrink. so that error signal can flow all the way back through a deep network without dying out.
And that made a huge difference in training speed.
A massive difference. They reported a 6-fold speed up in convergence compared to the old TON networks. Suddenly, an 8-layer network wasn't just possible, it was practical.
So RealU gives you the depth and speed, but you still have this huge overfitting problem. 60 million parameters is a lot to control.
It is. So they brought in a two-pronged defense. The first was a brand new technique at the time called dropout.
Right, in those big, fully connected layers at the end.
Yes. During training, they would randomly turn off, just to zero, 50% of the neurons in those layers for each training example.
Which sounds kind of crazy, like you're deliberately damaging your own network.
It does. But it forces the neurons to learn features that are useful on their own without relying on their specific neighbors being active. It makes the whole system much more robust.
Okay, so that's prong one. What was the second?
Data augmentation. Basically creating more data from the data you already have.
And they did this in some really clever ways.
Two main ways. First, they took the 256 by 256 images and randomly cropped out 224 by 224 patches from them, and they also did horizontal flips.
Just simple transformations.
Simple, but incredibly effective. Between those two tricks, they estimated it expanded the effective size of their training data set by a factor of 2,048.
Wow, so it's like a data cheat code?
It really is. And then they added something called PCA color perturbation. They were essentially tweaking the RGB color channels to simulate different lighting conditions.
So the network would learn to recognize, say, a cat, whether it's in bright sunlight or in the shade.
Exactly. It made the model more robust to the environment, and that little trick alone cut the top 1 error rate by over 1%.
And there are other little tweaks too, right? Like overlapping pooling and, what was it, local response normalization?
Yeah, LRN. It was sort of a bio-inspired idea that was popular at the time. It helped reduce the error by another 1.2%. It's since been replaced by better techniques like batch norm. But in 2012, all these little things added up to that big victory.
It's clear that AlexNet was this amazing synergy of ideas. But what's so interesting looking back is that it wasn't a perfect model. In fact, its flaws kind of became the blueprint for what came next.
That is the perfect way to put it. It was a transitional fossil. The next generation of models like VGG and GoogleNet, they looked directly at AlexNet's compromises and said, okay, we can do that better.
So let's talk about the first big one. That giant 11 by 11 filter in the very first layer.
Right, with a big stride of 4. The idea was to quickly shrink the image size and get a large receptive field to see a big chunk of the image at once. It was an efficient choice for the time.
But not the optimal one.
Not optimal. People quickly realized you were losing a lot of fine-grained information right at the start. So VGGNet came along and showed that you could get the same receptive field by stacking a few small 3x3 filters instead.
And that was better because
you used fewer parameters, and you got more nonlinearity because you had more activation layers. That stack of 3x3s pretty much immediately became the standard for all modern CNNs.
Okay, so that was one flaw, but the second one was arguably much, much bigger, the top-heavy design.
Oh, yeah. This was the model's Achilles heel. Of the 60 million total parameters in AlexNet, over 90% of them, something like 54 million, were crammed into the last 2 fully connected layers.
54 million parameters in just 2 layers. That's wild.
It's incredibly inefficient. And that's why they needed aggressive regularization like dropout. It was a huge source of overfitting and a massive computational bottleneck.
So how did the next generation solve that problem? Because that seems like a fundamental design issue.
The solution was revolutionary, and it was called Global Average Pooling, or GAP.
Okay.
Instead of flattening all the features into a giant vector and feeding it into these massive layers, GoogleNet and ResNet just took the average of each feature map and fed that directly to the final classifier.
They just got rid of those giant layers entirely.
Wiped them off the map.
Yeah.
And the impact was staggering. GoogleNet, using GAP, went from AlexNet's 60 million parameters down to only about 5 million.
A more than 10x reduction in size with better performance.
Way better performance. It was a total paradigm shift in efficiency. AlexNet's biggest weakness truly became the blueprint for the next big leap forward.
Now, before we wrap up, we have to talk about that famous number, 15.3%. Because there's an important piece of context there, isn't there?
There is, and it's important for historical accuracy. That number, the one that won the competition, wasn't from a single AlexNet model.
Right. It was an ensemble.
It was an ensemble.
Right.
They averaged the predictions from 7 different models including some pre-trained versions.
Yeah.
Which is a totally standard competition strategy, but it's good to know.
But even a single model was still a world beater.
Oh, absolutely. A single AlexNet still got an 18.2% error rate. The next best, the non-deep learning competitor, was at 26.2%. So ensemble or not, it was a landslide victory. The revolution was real.
So to synthesize this for you, the listener, AlexNet's win was this perfect synergy. You had the data from ImageNet, the speed from GPUs, and this killer algorithmic combo of ReLU, dropout, and data augmentation.
And I think the biggest lesson looking back is that so much of its innovation came directly from its limitations. That dual GPU design was a hack, a workaround for not having enough memory, and it accidentally made the model better.
It seems like sometimes those hard constraints are what force you to be truly creative. They push you away from just making small, incremental improvements and force you to find a whole new way of doing things.
Which leaves you with a final thought to think about. Where in your own work, or anywhere in technology, might a tough limitation, a constraint you're fighting against, actually be the secret catalyst for a real breakthrough?
Look for the constraints, and maybe that's where you'll find the revolution.